two rules that I want us to be aware of as we start looking at what happens when there's a double shift. And what we mean by that is we're going to see that at the same time our demand curve is going to shift and our supply curve is going to shift. So we're going to have a completely new equilibrium. But two rules that we need to know. Keep this in mind. Either our price or our quantity is going to be unknown, and the answer will never be stays the same. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but I promise you it will here in just a couple minutes. So let's take a look at what happens to our equilibrium if we see a shift of supply and a shift of demand happening at the same time. So let's say we have an increase in supply at the same time we have an increase in demand. So both of them are going to shift to the right. So we have a shift of the right of our supply curve and then a shift to the right of our demand curve. And if you notice, we are at a new equilibrium there, right? Wherever our our S2 and our D2 intersect. Now, what has happened to our equilibrium? So first and foremost, I want us to look at the price. What has happened to the price? If you look at this, a lot of you might say, well, it looks like the price has stayed the same. But if you remember one of our rules, the price will never stay the same. So we have to say our price is unknown. Now, why is it unknown? Why can't we say it stays the same? It sure as heck looks like it stays the same. Well, the reason is that if we look at that table down below, when we have an increase in demand and an increase in supply, what happens to our price if those things were to happen independently, right? If there was an increase in just demand, it would cause our equilibrium price to go up. If there was just an increase in supply, it would cause our equilibrium price to go down. So we would have a positive change in price if demand increased, a negative change in price if supply increased. So here's what I want to ask you. When those things happen together, what's a positive plus a negative? We have to say it's unknown. Like we can't for certain say that a positive plus a negative is a positive. We can't for certain say a positive plus a negative is a negative. We don't have enough information. So because we don't know exactly how big those shifts were, despite me drawing them like they looked like they were the same size shifts, we have to say it's unknown because we don't know if it was if the positive was bigger or if the negative was bigger. Now, what we can say for certain is that the quantity has increased. And the quantity has increased because you can see, looking at our table, if demand was to increase on its own, we have an increase in quantity. If we had supply to increase on its own, we'd have an increase in quantity. And we know a positive plus a positive is a positive. And again, you can look at the graph and pretty easily tell that our quantity has increased. So if we have an increase in supply at the same time as we have an increase in demand, it would cause our quantity to increase, but it would cause our price to be unknown. It would be an unknown change to the price. Now, what happens if we have a decrease in both, meaning that we have a decrease in our supply at the same time that we see a decrease in our demand? Well, again, looking at this graph, what has happened to each one of those things? We look at the price and we want to be tempted to say it looks like the price stays the same, but remember our rule, the rule says it will never be stays the same. And the reason it will never be stays the same is again because if we took a demand decrease and a supply decrease on their own, there'd be a negative change in price when the demand decreases, a positive change in price when supply decreases, and we have to say a negative plus a positive is we're not sure. There's not enough information because we don't know if a positive plus a negative is a positive or a negative in this case. Now, we can say for certain, we look at that quantity and we can tell from that original equilibrium to that new point where they intersect, we can say for sure that we have a negative change in quantity and a negative change in quantity, and a negative plus a negative is always a negative. And so our quantity decreases in this case. So again, remember those rules, guys. It will never be stays the same. One of them is always going to be unknown. Whenever we see that our supply and demand move in the same direction, it's going to be our price that's unknown. But let's take a look at what happens whenever our supply and our demand move in separate directions. So suppose that we have an increase in our supply at the same time that we have a decrease in our demand, right? So what happens here? Well, again, I had highlighted those two movements happening independently there in our table. And so we can kind of look at this and we can say, okay, well, what happens to our price? Well, even just looking at the graph, we can say pretty certainly that our price decreases. But why? Well, again, if we look at our table, we notice that if demand was to decrease on its own, we'd have a decrease in price. If supply was to increase on its own, we'd have a decrease in price. And a decrease plus a decrease is always going to be a decrease. A negative plus a negative is always a negative. So we see that our new equilibrium, we have a decrease in price. Now, at our new equilibrium, what's happened to our quantity? Well, in this case, our quantity is going to be unknown because, again, looking at our table, we have to say, well, if demand was to decrease on its own, we'd have a decrease in quantity. If supply was to increase on its own, we'd have an increase in quantity. And a decrease plus an increase, or a negative plus a positive, is we're not sure. We don't have enough information. So whenever we don't have enough information, we just have to say the quantity is unknown, or sometimes you might hear it as said is indeterminate. We cannot determine what has happened to our quantity in this case. Again, even though on the graph it looks like it stays the same, we cannot say that. It's only because I drew the shifts to be about the same size that it looks like it stayed the same. And finally, we have a decrease in supply at the same time as we see an increase in demand. Well, what happens here? Looking at those independently, we can see that demand increase has an increase in price, a supply decrease has an increase in price. So we can say for certain that our price has increased because a positive change in price plus a positive change in price results in a positive change in price. But when it comes to the quantity, again, an increase in demand would cause the equilibrium quantity to increase. A decrease in supply would cause the equilibrium quantity to decrease. So what's an increase plus a decrease, or a positive plus a negative? Well, it's an unknown. We're really not sure. Now, guys, I encourage you so much. Go take a look at the practice problems. Work through these practice problems, whether it's in the class resource ones or the ones that are a little bit further down in this agenda. Your practice problems that are the practice problems for the unit on Canvas, take a look at those. It will be so incredibly helpful for you to get that practice in.